Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. every Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy and the co-founder of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'll be talking with jamilDakwar. Jamil is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Program, which is dedicated to holding the U.S. accountable to its international human rights obligations and commitments. Jamal is also the chair of the Adalat Justice Project's advisory board. Born and raised in Haifa, he was one of the founding lawyers of Adalat, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. And since the mid-2000s, he has led the ACLU's international advocacy, including at the United Nations. He will not be speaking today on behalf of or as a staff member from the ACLU, but he'll be giving his personal opinions. He is an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Hunter College, and Bard College, so he gets around. We will get to Jamil in just a second, but first, a couple of quick announcements. I want to remind you that if you're listening to this show while driving around town, you can listen to the full show. If you miss some of it when you run into a store or something, you can listen to the full show by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on Retake on the Radio on the homepage. It's on the right side of the homepage. And all of our shows are there in chronological order, so you can binge watch Retake on the Radio for days and for free. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn a good deal from them, and we better do so soon. Last announcement, on October 26th from 6 p.m. to 7:30, Retake will be hosting a Zoominar, How Would a New Mexico State Public Bank Help Diversify Our State Economy and Advance Economic Justice? Joining Alliance for Local Prosperity Executive Director Angela Merkert and AFLEP's Public Bank Campaign Director and retired banker Harold Dixon. We will also have on the call Helga Garcia, Chair of the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council, and two rural business people who will describe how lack of access to capital impedes their business development and how a state public bank could change that. This is particularly focused on rural and farm New Mexico. Finally, the panel will include Senator Kerry Hamlin and Representative Christine Chandler, who will lay out the legislative challenges. Wall Street bankers have already begun their disinformation campaign, sowing seeds of fear among legislators and the public, and Retake peeps like you must get fully informed and ready to counter their disinformation. Join us to find out more about how a public bank would benefit New Mexico. And you can find out more information by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the actions and events in the homepage banner, and info and the link to register for that Zoominar will be near the very top of that page. Okay, well, let's get started. Let's meet jamilDakwar and learn from him about the deteriorating situation in Palestine and how the U.S. is conspiring to suppress opposition to Israel's policies in relation to Palestine. Welcome to the show, Jamil.
Thank you, Paul, for having me on.
I like to let guests introduce themselves. So how did you become involved with the Palestinian struggle, and how did that lead to a position at the ACLU?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. As you mentioned, I will not be speaking as an ACLU staff member. I actually was born and raised in Haifa, which is now in the north of Israel. I went to one of the best high schools that are actually church-run high school, because historically in Palestine, even before Israel was created, the best schools that were providing education were actually missionary schools that were created by the church, different denominations. And this particular school, particularly the high school part of it, was the where I started to get involved in advancing justice and human rights for my people. In a time when there was the beginning of the first Intifada in 1987, and leading up to the end of the first Intifada and the beginning of the so-called peace process, the Madrid process that was started 2 years before the Oslo process. So my activism as a student continued through my academic work or studies at Tel Aviv University. I went there and I did my law degree, and I was the elected chair of the Arab Student Committee and worked on issues of both discrimination against Palestinian students as well as raising awareness regarding the struggle for liberation and self-determination for the Palestinian people, in founding a student movement called Jafra and Baladna, later on another youth organization based in Haifa. And then afterwards, after graduating from law school, I joined one of the first Arab-run legal organization called Adala, which you mentioned at the beginning of the show. It was 1996, 97, when this organization was just starting, and I joined them as one of the founding lawyers. Essentially taking legal advocacy on behalf of Palestinian citizens first, who comprise 20% of Israel's population, but were subject to institutional racism and systemic racism and discrimination for decades since the founding of Israel in 1948. So we were using the legal tools to advance civil rights and human rights in whole host of areas, including in land and housing, in access to budgets, in access to equal rights in language rights, and so there's a lot of there where I have been able to focus more on the legal remedies that could be possible within very limited possible Israeli legal system. And from there, I continued, I pursued my master's degree at NYU Law School in the early 2002, when I moved to the United States as a student, and then decided to stay after I got a fellowship with Human Rights Watch. I worked in other countries in the Middle East, including Morocco, Egypt, as well as in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, working mostly on issues of torture and detention. And that background, the work that I did in Adala, using international human rights in my lawyering, in my advocacy inside Israel, in the courts, and before international bodies, as well as the work that I did at Human Rights Watch, really led me to the ACLU, where the ACLU in 2004 founded the Human Rights Program with hiring me and two other human rights attorneys that were tasked with building institutional capacity to use international law to address U.S. violations of international law, both in the domestic arena as well as overseas. As you recall, that was the time of the so-called war on terror, the global war on terror, where the United States under the Bush administration was committing atrocities with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, opening of Guantanamo, etc. So I've started working on these issues, and now I've become the director of the Human Rights Program. Again, I'm happy to be on the show to talk to you in my personal capacity.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a good introduction. I think we got a sense of someone who's been in the fray for a while. For this interview, I'd like to assume that our listeners have only a passing or slightly better than passing understanding of the Palestinian struggle. So let's take a moment to contextualize the conflict. In September 2000, the Camp David negotiations collapsed, and soon after, the Second Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising, began. Can you give our listeners a rundown of what triggered the Intifada and how the conflict has worsened over the years?
Sure, Paul. I think it's really hard in a very short time to cover the long struggle of the Palestinian people. And the Second Intifada that started in 2000, when I was living and working as a human rights lawyer based in Haifa area in the north. It's really hard to capture the long history of nearly a century long struggle for recognizing Palestinian self-determination, opposing both the British mandate that was imposed on Palestine in 1922 after the end of World War I, And with that, the British mandate and the British government promises and support for the Zionist movement to create a Jewish state or Jewish homeland in Palestine. And I think it is important to go back to that history pre-1948, meaning before Israel was created, because Palestinians resisted and had led uprisings from those years. From those years of calling for their attention for their plight, for the fact that they were being subject to colonial project, and the Zionist movement was very clear. It was made it clear that it was a settler colonial project. And so the 1936 uprising, for example, that was happening in Palestine of people in all parts of Palestine, and it was suppressed by the British mandate, by British troops. Of course, in 1948, the Palestinian people lost their homeland in battles that happened all over the country. The Zionist militias and Zionist fighters and armed groups were far better equipped. They, by the way, outnumbered the Palestinian fighters and even the Arab armies that joined the struggle. A lot of people think that, oh, it was not the case, but that's historically incorrect. That, as if the Palestinian fighters and the Arab armies that helped them were outnumbered the Zionist fighters. And there was a lot of support and sympathy because of the horrors of the Holocaust, and there are a lot of people who joined the support for the Zionist movement in Palestine. Was the idea that the Jewish people, the solution for the Jewish people is for the ending persecution, ending anti-Semitism, ending and giving the refugees of the World War II and those who survived the genocide in Europe, was to create a state for the Jewish people. And that was resisted by Palestinian because they felt that was imposed on them. There was a unfair partition of Palestine, and the resolution that was adopted by the United Nations in 1947. If you look at the demographics, and you look at the numbers and the way it was divided, and more importantly, the fact that the Zionist movement saw this partition as a temporary acceptance of the solution. It was clear for Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion, who was the founder of the State of Israel and one of the leaders of the Zionist movement, that was a temporary acceptance, that we accept the partition of Palestine so we get a foot on that territory, and then we would expand. And in fact, the war in 1948 and both the massacres, the forcing Palestinians out of Palestine, in the ethnic cleansing that took place was calculated in order to make sure that the armed Zionist groups that became later on part of what is now Israel Army or Israel Defense Forces would be taking as much land as possible and kick out as many Palestinians as possible. And to fast forward to 2000, I think there were attempts to reach some sort of a solution or a reconciliation. All of these attempts were based on the idea that the Palestinians have to accept Israel as a Jewish state that is dominating over 80% of historic Palestine homeland, that no Palestinian refugees who were kicked out or forced or left temporarily during the 48 war would be allowed to go back to their homeland, to their homes and properties that were they had to leave or forced to leave in 48, and that there would continue to be the idea that Israel would dominate and would not give equal rights to even the Palestinians who would remain within the state of Israel as a minority. And so that continues to be the struggle. The struggle is not just about all these different proposals that were made failed because they undermined or did not recognize what happened in 1948. It did not deal with the notion of why the state of Israel was created and what kinds of regime it put forward in order to uphold the rights of Jewish people in historic Palestine while denying and violating the rights of anyone who is not Jewish. From laws like the law of return or the nationality law, or the law that allowed to confiscate lands from Palestinian-owned private land and to nationalize those lands and put them in the hands of the Land Administration Authority, and to build Jewish-only settlement, Jewish-only towns inside the state of Israel, which is, again, 80% more or less of historic Palestine. Since 1948, not a single Palestinian village, town, or city, new ones, were created. While there were hundreds of Israeli Jewish towns and villages, kibbutzim, moshavim, etc. The only exception were townships that were created for the Arab Bedouin Palestinian community in the south. They were trying to force them to live in urban centers and push them from their semi-nomadic life and access to their traditional lands, which was rejected by many of the Arab Bedouin communities to this day. So there's a clear system that was created in 1948, and it was planned in that way to create a system of separation, a system of two tiers of rights. One would be for people who are belong to the Jewish faith, or themselves Jewish or Jews, and those who are not Jewish. And so in Israel, there is no such a thing. There's no recognition of something called Palestinian. You would not see in a single document, a single law or regulation, anything that had to do with the name or the category Palestinians. Palestinians are called Arabs, and the ones who live in Israel, they're called Israeli Arabs, to deny the Palestinian roots, to deny the idea that they are linked to the historic Palestine. The same with the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem that was occupied in '67, or the ones who live in the West Bank. They are referred to in more now in the Israeli politics, but by and large are denied their very basic rights. The idea that they have collective existence, the collective rights, their right to self-determination is continuing to be denied. And that's what really Oslo was about. The Oslo Agreement that was reached in 1993 was about Israel being recognized by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and yet Israel did not recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination. It was only recognizing that the PLO is the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. And here really you see the disparity or the imbalance of power, where Israel, the most powerful military economy in the Middle East and one of the 10 most important and powerful militaries in the world, dictating what this peace process would look like. In fact, they had to negotiate it in secret, where the Palestinians didn't even have the best legal advisors, or to use all the geopolitical pressures on the very few people within the PLO who were involved in the PLO negotiations. And ultimately, the PLO submitted to that because of the fall of the Soviet Union after the first Iraq War. There was no reason, and that led to them to accept Oslo as a temporary solution for the creation of a Palestinian state on 20% of historic Palestine. And even with that compromise, even with that Palestinian leadership compromise, Israel continued to build Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including in East Jerusalem. And now it numbers over 650 or 700,000 Israeli Jewish people who live in the occupied territories, which is violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions that constitute actually a war crime. And that led really to the second intifada, back to your really question, where the Palestinians felt that their rights were not recognized historically. They were given a really limited access but limited sovereignty, and the Palestinian viable state was like a Swiss cheese, what they call, like where there was a lot of Israeli settlements will be, even with the swap of lands between between Israeli settlements will be annexed to Israel, and Palestinians taking land from what is now Israel. It was clear that the idea was to maintain the status quo in different ways, meaning Israel's dominance over almost everything that controls Palestinian life, and the creation of some sort of an entity that would take charge or control over the Palestinian civilian life. It's like a subcontracting, whether it's a security subcontracting to oppress those who would be against such a deal, or providing services such as like municipal services, collecting garbage and law and order and education services and that sort of thing. Palestinians didn't accept that, and I think that was really the new generation of Palestinians who started the second Intifada, and unfortunately from a civilian unrest or opposition rebellion, it immediately moved into an armed, mostly armed struggle, and that gave Israel the opportunity to suppress that in a very, very harsh way by using force to reinvade many of the cities in 2002. I was there. I was working again as a human rights lawyer, and so that is where what the second Intifada was about, was really a failure of not only that Israel is not expected to recognize the Palestinian rights, but the failure of the international community, particularly the United States, pushing and pressuring the Palestinian leadership to accept a deal that was not fair, that was not sustainable, that was not something that would provide a long-lasting justice and peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. And unfortunately, we're still living in the consequences of that failure, of people still realizing that we can continue to maintain this control over millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, no voting rights, no basic human rights, not even the right to protest is allowed in the West Bank and Gaza, allowing settlers to be armed, and we see the videos of how the settlers, Israeli settlers in the West Bank, attacking Palestinians as well as Israeli human rights activists with impunity. Israeli soldiers killing children, and this year is a record number of Palestinian children being killed with impunity. And nothing is being done, while and journalists, including Shireen Abu Akleh's killing, was one another example of how Israeli forces feel emboldened after the US administration gave basically the signal that we were not going to really push back on whatever you do, as long as we deal with the outside issues, the regional issues, whether it's Iran, whether it's the promoting the so-called accords, peace accords with what I call normalization and really arms deals is between Israel and the four countries, Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and Sudan.
Okay, so well, that's an earful there, but I did a good job of capturing, almost 100 years of colonialism. I need to take a quick break here to remind our listeners that you're listening to KSFR, and KSFR is more important than ever in these times of misinformation in the mainstream and the social media. You get good straight news from KSFR. You get excellent cultural and musical programming and discussions like this one and Democracy Now! And the show that precedes us, Richard Wolff, on Economic Update. These are all excellent programs that come to your home for free, but they're not produced for free. KSFR has costs, and that's for a studio and for program managers and engineers. And so I'd appreciate it if after you listen to this show, you go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button and pass 10, 20, 50 bucks their way and view that as your ticket for admission to some great programming throughout the year. Thank you very much on behalf of KSFR. So we're going to switch focus here just a little bit, Jamil, because we want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the United States and the efforts to support Palestine. And one of the historic strategies that the US and the European communities have employed has been to boycott or to divest from Israel. And there are a variety of campaigns in the United States now to rebuff that, and basically to say that any kind of boycott is anti-Semitism. And how effective has that strategy demonizing the opposition to Israeli strategies been?
I think it's been working for some time. Unfortunately, over the last decades, particularly in this country, most Americans have been only hearing and have only been subject to the narrative of the Israel and Zionism, meaning Israel is our ally. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. It gives everyone equal rights. It is for peace, while the Palestinians are against peace. They want, and that we have shared values with the United States. And I think I like to start with that because I think that's really important. The shared values, I agree that there are shared values between Israel and the United States, but they're not shared values of democracy and promotion of human rights and freedom and liberation but it's the shared values of promoting colonialism, of promoting mass displacement, of promoting supremacy for one ethnic group or one religious group over the other, of promoting a denial of equal rights, including voting rights, including acknowledgement of what happened in the past. While in the United States, we have a long history.
Excuse me, Jamil, I'm sorry to have to interrupt you, but we've only got about 45 seconds of radio show left, and I want to make sure we get a chance to describe your talk, that you came to Santa Fe for a reason. Can you tell us a little bit about the talk that you've got coming up? You got 30 seconds.
Well, the talk will be focusing on the efforts to essentially portray any Palestinian rights advocacy in the United States as anti-Semitism, and why I think we should be fighting anti-Semitism while also fighting anti-Palestinian racism, and why both go hand in hand. The fight against racism is one. I think if there's a distinction should be made between hatred against Jewish people and Jews, which is unacceptable, is reprehensible, and should be fought with all our heart. At the same time, we should not be conflating that with criticism of Israel or Zionism. And this conflation is really where many politicians are pushing these laws that are preventing many people from acting to support the Palestinian rights in either divestment and boycott campaign. And I think there is an important event that's happening in Santa Fe on Friday night. And you should be, if you're interested, you should be contacting Jeff Haas of Santa Fe Justice for Palestine, and his email is jeffreyhaas42@gmail.com. Again, it's Jeffrey Haas.
H-A-A-S. Yes.
Yes, it's Jeffrey H. Haas42@gmail.com for more information about this event. And you will be hearing more analysis of why I think that should be very careful about not crossing the line of violating First Amendment rights, free speech rights, and censoring legitimate advocacy and speech and organizing in the name of protecting a country, in the name of protecting ideological movement, which is Zionism, which is the state of Israel. This is separate from fighting anti-Semitism more broadly. Thank you.
Okay, Jamil, we'll continue this conversation for our YouTube recording for just a few more minutes, but I have to close the show now. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and above all, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye. Okay, we had to remain quiet for just a minute so that the studio knew when the show was over and when the less formal YouTube conversation can continue. And I know that Jamil only has about 5 more minutes, maybe 10. And so let's continue the discussion about this anti-Semitism. And I know that in the United States, and in particular now in New Mexico, the state of New Mexico and the Santa Fe mayor have signed on to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, their definition of anti-Semitism. And basically when you dive into it, you take a look at the examples of what they consider anti-Semitism, and it's boycotting, it's raising your voice against Israel, it's free, anything that could be free speech. And it seems odd to me that given the long history of boycotts in the United States, whether it was in the civil rights movement, the Me Too movement, whether it was in relation to South Africa, or the history of in the environmental movement of divestment as viable strategies, First Amendment strategies. Yet in this case, in relation to Israel, that just is not tolerable. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I mean, it's really bizarre where we have the only country that is requiring and demanding and actively advocating, meaning the state of Israel, and even the former prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, admitted that and took credit for pushing for these anti-BDS legislation or bills. These bills that were introduced several years ago, some of them are in the legislature, some of them enacted through an executive order by the governors, essentially make it criminalizing or making it adding restrictions on people who may want to participate in the boycott of Israel. And first of all, one thing to remember, they are dealing with all Israel as one, including the territories occupied in 1967. So there's no distinction between universally recognized occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. Two, there is an equation between as if Israel is a person. In a lot of those situations, what they are asking the legislation, or they're asking people to, is that if you are calling to boycott Israel as if you are calling to boycott a person and discriminating against a person or a people. And that in of itself is fundamentally flawed and wrong. Why is that? Because Israel is not a country, is not an individual, is a country that was founded as a Jewish state, and it's a political entity. And as such, it has also, by the way, Israel as such has also 20% of its citizens, although they're rendered second-class citizens, but they are more than 20% that are not Jewish. So the fact that there is a demand on equalizing between Israel and any other people in the United States, and to create this category where you could not boycott or discriminate against Israel, I guess Israel is having this particular special status, is really ridiculous. It's something that we should not accept. No country should have any special status. All countries, including the United States, should be subject to criticism, to boycotts if they are warranted, as South Africa was this target of boycotts, divestment campaigns, and sanctions. So I think it's important. The other thing that I think really important is that this definition, the new definition of anti-Semitism, when it was put forward for the sake of monitoring acts of anti-Semitism, particularly in the European context, and it wasn't really meant to become an instrument of censorship, instruments of shutting down legitimate conversations. Yes, as I said before, we have to fight anti-Semitism at all levels of society and the government levels, but it doesn't mean we use anti-Semitism and weaponizing it in order to block certain speech that is, you may disagree with it, but it's still illegitimate speech. You may not use anti-Semitism in order to say you cannot criticize the state of Israel. For example, if you say the state of Israel is a racist country because it created a system of apartheid, that would be anti-Semitic according to the new definition. That is very, very wrong and problematic, because that means any individual who has whether you are a scholar or you are an activist or just an American learning about what's happening in Palestine, and you want to express your views, you are deemed anti-Semitic if you called Israel an apartheid state or racist state, or said Israel should be subject to sanctions, or Israel should be singled out because the way it treated Palestinians since 1948 and even before it was created by the Zionist movement. So that is where I think we need to be very aware of. I think these laws are politically driven. They politicians are scoring points and trying to show that they are supportive of the state of Israel. And there's by the way, a great film that was done by produced by Just Vision. It's called Boycott, the name of the film, that traces the background or the history of this movement to criminalize or to outlaw the boycott of Israel. And now this case, there are several cases that were litigated that were challenging these laws, and most of them won on First Amendment grounds. The most recent case that is now heading to the Supreme Court is a case on behalf of Arkansas Times, which is a publication that has been there for decades. And this publication was prevented from selling ads, and which is a major revenue for them, unless they pledge not to boycott Israel. They have nothing to do with Palestinian rights advocacy. They say the reason that they were given that condition is because Arkansas as a whole, as a state, passed a law where contractors with the state have to pledge that they would not boycott Israel if they were to contract with the state. So the state is deciding which opinions are legitimate or not. That in of itself is a violation of the First Amendment. This case is going to the Supreme Court now. The Supreme Court is asked to review this case. And we hope that the Supreme Court will see the ramifications of the importance of upholding First Amendment rights when it comes to the right to boycott. It's been up, as you mentioned, it's been used since the Tea Party in the Boston, since that era. The
Good example.
Yeah, as well as the civil rights era, the boycotts, the Alabama bus boycott, including the boycotts against governments that violated international human rights and created a system of apartheid like South Africa did in the mid-1980s. So, and we do use boycott in almost everything we do as activists, as advocates, as people. People utilize it as a form of expression, as a form of political advocacy in order to make change. And so taking that tool and rendering it unlawful, essentially, and illegitimate, only in the context of Palestine advocacy is really very concerning. And it's going to also impact other movements, particularly in the fossil fuel movement, where there's a loss of boycotts in the context of reproductive rights. We've seen that being replicated in copycats. So I really warn everyone to not to be quick in determining that anything that is being said to be anti-Semitic under that definition should be taken without questions. I think we should be very concerned about that, and we should be, while working very, very hard on uprooting anti-Semitism, all forms of racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, against all people, including Islamophobia as well, and anti-Palestinian racism, which has been going on for years. But by weaponizing anti-Semitism, we will only make things worse. Because it will only turn this into a rather than a legitimate debate about the issues, it will turn into targeting Jewish American communities as if they are the ones associated with Israel. And that's where I think the threat to this is aligned. So that's what the former President Trump is making repeatedly, where he's keeps saying that, as if American Jewish communities are not part of the country, as if Israel is their home or some sort. That is dangerous. Jewish people all over the world have made it very clear that they are not and cannot be represented by the state of Israel. And there should be a clear distinction between what the state of Israel is, what Zionism represents, which is the creation of the state of Israel and defending Israel in its form as a country that was built only for the Jewish people, and distinguishing that from the Jewish people who live in all over the world, including in the United States, and they should be having equal rights, should have been protected from violence and from discrimination and from bigotry. By weaponizing anti-Semitism, you are really showing that there is no distinction between the two. And I think that is a very, very dangerous exercise and really would put more people at risk of being targeted, not because of anything that they said or did, just because by associating them with the state of Israel. That is the anti-Semitic thing that we need to be watch and be warned against and be fighting against. I myself, I can speak to that. There is nothing that I hate more than seeing acts of racism, but I cannot also live with the idea that a state can be immune from criticism just because it is called a Jewish state. If that is the same norm applied to other countries, then Saudi Arabia will say we are a Muslim state or Islamic state. We follow the Sharia law, so we should be also immune. And if you criticize, Saudi Arabia, you will be called Islamophobic, and I think that's wrong as well. The same thing if you're criticizing the acts done by white Christian supremacists, and you say, well, if you do that, that's sort of making you, if you're attacking the way that they're perceiving, kind of that's making you a bigot. And I think that's where we need to be very careful of making the distinction between protecting people and what are ideologies, political movements that shouldn't be treated as people. They should be subject to our scrutiny. They should be debated. We will have different opinions, but that is not the same as discriminating. I don't think that Israel should be given that special standard and special status.
So I know you're going to have to run to a meeting, but can you
Yes.
just tell us real quickly, what can people in New Mexico do to support Palestinian struggle?
I think they first look for local groups, for example, the Santa Fe Justice for Palestine group, or other organizations active. The Adalah Justice Project, which I'm on their board, supports cross-movement struggle and advocacy on Palestine and linking it to indigenous rights and Black activism and Black people's liberation. There's also a lot of organizations that are campaigning with boycott campaigns, and there's a lot of way to support humanitarian organizations that are supporting the situation, the crisis in Gaza, including UN agencies like UNRWA, where they're taking care of the Palestinian refugees because of the fact that the international community failed to protect the Palestinian people and provide them with the rights like every other nation. So I hope that people will find locally, whether it's on campus, whether in your community, whether in nearby, any activity that supports Palestinian rights, because that is the right thing to do to support peace and hopeful future for all people, not just Palestinians, but also Jewish Israelis who are willing to live with inequality and with equal rights with the Palestinians.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jamil. I'm looking forward to seeing
Thank you very much.
your talk and dinner with Jeff Haas and Mariel Nanasi. And for those of you who are interested in going to this, please just write to Jeffrey, Jeffrey, Haas, HAAS 42, the number 42, at gmail.com, and let him know you'd like to attend, and he'll arrange for you to get tickets. That they're almost sold out, so you'll want to move on it. All right, and thank you very much, and I will see you next Friday.
See you.
Take care. And thank you, listeners. We'll be back next week.